Hi, this is Brent the Climate Guru. We're in Pine Island, Florida, just off the Gulf Coast near Fort Myers. Pine Island is the most beautiful island in the Gulf Coast of Florida. It's just a beautiful little island, 17 miles long, 3 miles wide. It was mostly forgotten by time and by the rapid development of cities and sprawling suburbs along Florida's coastal areas. Pine Island's still got an old, rural Florida atmosphere. Most of it's still undeveloped and still has a lot of the old pine forest for which it was named. The shorelines are thick with mangrove forest. You can see the mangrove forest behind me. They grow in brackish water mixed with salt and fresh and provide a very rich environment for so many marine species. Pine Island still has the look and atmosphere of the old Gulf Coast of Florida. 100 years ago, families lived in small fishing villages and on the many small islands in Pine Island Sound. Pine Island Sound is the body of water just to the west of Pine Island, going in the direction of the Gulf. And it's blocked and protected by the barrier islands of Sanibel Island, Captiva, and Cayo Costa. 100 years ago, families lived in these small fishing villages on the many small islands in Pine Island Sound, the body of water on its western side. They built fishing shacks. They built ice shacks to store the fresh fish, mostly mullet, that abounded in the very rich waters. Pine Island Sound, the body of water, is a coastal estuary with fresh water that flows from the mainland rivers. Peace River that flows into Charlotte Harbor, just to the north of here, and then the Caloosahatchee River that flows from the Florida mainland into San Carlos Bay. Mixes with salt water that comes in from the Gulf of Mexico through the barrier islands. It comes in through the passes of the barrier islands that protects the Pine Island Sound from the winds and powerful waves of the Gulf of Mexico. And the shallow estuary mix of salt and fresh water teems with marine life. Estuaries are very rich with marine life, mixed of salt and fresh water, crabs, fish, many shore and wading birds, oyster beds abound. And what covers most of the bottom of Pine Island Sound are seagrass beds, which is one of the richest marine environments anywhere in the world. It's where juvenile fish and crabs hide from predators and can gray. And the seagrass beds stabilize the bottom sediments. They are actually underwater flowering plants that grow in the upper sunlit layers of the estuary. Like land plants, they engage in photosynthesis, they absorb carbon, and they emit oxygen. At the water's edge of Pine Island, all the other little islands within Pine Island Sound, you'll find mangrove forests like the ones behind me. And they grow in salt water. The red mangroves in particular have very tall root structures, and they filter the salt through their roots. And they also emit salt in the leaves in the upper parts of the tree. And the important thing about mangroves is that they are the nursery for juvenile fish that mature and populate the entire region. It's where the fish spawn, the juvenile fish and crabs are born, and they can live there and develop protected from predators. Coastal birds, where we have many, use them for rookeries and foraging areas. Inward of the mangroves on Pine Island and all the other little islands around are salt marshes, which are flooded or dried out as the tides come in and go, and they're prime feeding areas for many animals. In Pine Island Sound and the islands surrounding it, we have bald eagles, osprey, and you can see a lot of osprey, red-shouldered hawk, which I saw one this morning, brown pelicans. And coming down in the boat yesterday, we saw white pelicans, which I've never seen before. They're much bigger than brown pelicans, and they congregate on islands, small islands in the Sound, where they spend the winter. We also see the snake birds that actually dive underwater, swim underwater, have long necks, and catch fish. There's many gulls and terns, wading birds everywhere. The great egret, ibis, the great blue heron, the roseate spoonbill, the most colorful, beautiful bird with a sort of a spoon-shaped snout that moves back and forth in the water to catch its prey. And these are in the mangroves around Pine Island. Also, we see the wood stork and the kingfisher. There's so many kinds of fish that abound in Pine Island Sound estuary. It's so rich. We have snook, redfish, sea trout, mangrove snapper, flounder, and even seahorses. There are many black-tip sharks and bull sharks. Bull sharks can live in both fresh and salt water, and even stingrays. Pine Island Sound is known for its huge schools of mullet that have been important for very many years for the commercial fishing in Pine Island Sound. The fishermen at first smoked them to preserve them, and early years shipped them to Cuba, which is only about 100 miles away. And then later on, they were iced and put on trains in nearby depots and sent north to the markets. We also have large populations of manatees, and they grow up to 13 feet long, and they feed on the seagrass meadows on the bottom of Pine Island Sound. There's bottlenose dolphin. They abound in the Sound and the Gulf waters outside of the Sound, in the open Gulf of Mexico. They often play alongside boats. Yesterday, when we were coming down in my boat, we had several porpoise that swam alongside the boat and played. Sailors have always say they're good luck. Pine Island Sound is very rich in crustaceans. Blue crabs, stone crabs are very important commercially. Conchs, oyster beds, mussels. In the rivers that come into the Sound, we have many alligators. And at the mouth of the rivers that live in brackish water are crocodiles, which are very endangered species in Florida. In the rivers that come into the Sound, Peace River, Caloosahatchee, we have river otters. And let's not forget the turtles. We have the Atlantic loggerhead turtle. Grows up to 3 feet long and can weigh 300 pounds. It nests on nearby Sanibel Island and Captiva beaches. A soft-shell turtle and striped mud turtle, they live in the freshwater ponds on Pine Island. And on the dry areas of the pine woods, we have Florida box turtles, which can live 100 years. So we came down in my small boat from Sarasota, Florida, along the Intercoastal Waterway. It's about a 37-mile trip to Pine Island from Sarasota. It was about 3.5 hours in the boat. And we passed through Lemon Bay, then across Charlotte Harbor on the inside of Boca Grande, which is the large opening from the Gulf of Mexico into Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound. The trip took about 3 hours at a moderate speed. You can see on the map here that we have a Google Earth. You can see Pine Island Sound. You can see Sarasota to the north, Lemon Bay, and then coming into Boca Grande, and then on to further south into Pine Island Sound. You can also see on this map that we've prepared the little islands that abound in Pine Island Sound, where they have had fishermen over the years, native Indians, which we'll talk about, and where the first pioneer families lived, built fishing shacks and ice houses to preserve their catch, mostly mullet. About 2,000 years ago, about 500 BCE, Calusa Indians lived on Pine Island and other nearby coastal areas, and the islands nearby, particularly the islands in Pine Island Sound and further south, including Marco Island and other villages within Charlotte Harbor. More than 50 villages was their domain. The Calusa were very advanced Indians when they lived mostly by gathering shellfish, fish on Pine Island and the surrounding small islands. Spaniard Juan Ponce de Leon came to this area of Florida in the year 1513. He was the governor of Puerto Rico, exploring this part of Florida. He is known to be the first European that landed in Florida, and he encountered the Calusa. They were very fierce, very advanced tribe, and he was unable to make much progress either conquering them or converting them to Catholicism, which priests attempted to do. The Calusa lived on the rich waters of Pine Island Sound and Charlotte Harbor and the surrounding islands. And that's really what's determined the history of Pine Island through the present and through the centuries, where it was really a center of fishing. It continues to be. The Spanish found that the Calusa to be a very advanced, complex society. They were divided into nobles, commoners, and supported by a very powerful military force. The Calusa dominated other tribes in Florida, up to Lake Okeechobee, out to Cape Canaveral on the East Coast, including the Tequesta, which were the Indians in the Miami area at that time. They had longbows, and they had spears and atls, which are the sticks used to throw spears. Ponce de Leon was unsuccessful in conquering the Calusa. He returned again in 1521, another attempt to conquer the Calusa. He was unsuccessful, and he was shot with a poison arrow in the thigh. He returned immediately to Puerto Rico and died within a day or two. When the Spanish arrived, they saw very large, elaborate structures built on high shell mounds where the Calusa nobility lived, and they had very large ceremonial centers. The tall shell mounds and fish mounds were made of the bones and discarded shell of all the shellfish that they gathered and ate. Elaborate structures had graded ways, terraces, and ramps. They also found Calusa burial sites nearby that were discovered in subsequent years by archaeologists. The Calusa built a canal right across Pine Island, 2.5 miles long, about 15 feet wide, a few feet deep, and they used it to transport themselves in cypress canoes and other goods. Now, the Calusa were so powerful that the other tribes from Lake Okeechobee south had to pay tribute to them in skins, deer skins, and other similar items. The Calusa capital was Mound Key, just south of Pine Island Sound, which was excavated in later years. There was a very interesting incident in 1549. A group of young Spanish sailors were shipwrecked, including Hernando de Escalante de Fontaneda. He and his brother and the other members of the ship, who were probably shipwrecked in a hurricane, were captured by the Calusa. They were on their way from South America to Spain, to where they expected to study in Salamanca, Spain. He was only 13, so they were captured. And the Calusa killed everyone except Hernando. He survived somehow because he interpreted their gestures and what they said as to mean, we want to see you dance, we want to see you sing. He sang, he danced, and everybody else was killed. At the age of 13, when he was captured, he lived with the Calusa and for 17 years until he was 30 years old. He traveled all over South Florida with the Calusa, learned their language, and learned the language of other nearby tribes. His experience, which he wrote in a memoir, which has been kept in the archives of the Indies in Spain, are extremely important insights for anthropologists into the way that the Calusa lived in the 1500s, because the Calusa had no written language. Part of his memoir, he said, quote, "These islands are inhabited by a tall race of men and women, graceful and well-featured. They're good-looking people. There are 2 Indian villages on these islands, one is which is called the Village of Tears. The other, smaller in size, is the place where martyrdom has been suffered. These Indians possess neither gold nor silver, and still less clothing, for they go almost naked, or only a sort of apron. The dress of the men consists of braided palm leaves, and the women of moss, which grows in the trees and somewhat resembles wool. Their common food consists of fish, turtles, snails, tunny fish, and whales, which they catch in their seasons." He wrote a very long memoir. When he returned to Spain, he was rescued when he was 30 years old by Pedro Menendez de Avila, who was then the governor of Florida. The Spanish saw that the Calusa men painted their bodies every day, and they wore their hair in a knot atop their head. They're tall. The Spanish, all Europeans were very short, 5 foot, 5'2", and they noted the Calusa men were like 5'7". The women 5'4", very tall, good-looking people. They saw that they pierced their ears with ornaments, painted their bodies every day, and they saw very complex rituals conducted by the Calusa spiritual leaders. They had very large religious processions of hundreds, singing, elaborate art, painted wooden masks, beautifully carved wooden animal heads that were excavated in 1895 and 1896 by the Smithsonian Frank Hamilton Cushing, who came to Pine Island and nearby Key Marco, where they found all of these wooden artifacts underground in the marsh, which they dug up. And unfortunately, he had a young photographer and artist with him who made paintings of these artifacts. Colorful masks that you can see, elaborately carved wooden spears, clubs set with shark's teeth as weapons, wooden bowls, tools made from bone, hardwood, and shells. Magnificent things that are now in the Smithsonian Institute. On Pine Island, there were Calusa settlements in an area called Pineland, which is a complex archaeological site, which was excavated by archaeologists in the 1980s. It's a little settlement called Pineland. It was donated by the Rendell family to the state of Florida as an archaeological site. And the Calusa had a nearby freshwater source and remained 2 large shell mounds, which are called shell middens. They found many artifacts of the 1980s, which are on display at the Florida History Museum in Gainesville. The Calusa resisted the attempts by Spain to conquer them for 200 years until the 1700s, which speaks to their fierceness, their resistance. And if you look at the other native peoples in Mexico, in Central America, in Peru, the Spanish conquered them within 30 or 40 years between the diseases and the capturing them, overworking them, and the fierce war that they conducted against them. But the Calusa survived for 200 years. Finally, they succumbed in the early 1700s to European diseases like all Native Americans did. They were also captured as slaves, like many other Native people were in the Bahamas and other places, to be brought to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to Santo Domingo, to work in agriculture and in mines. The English, who were at war with the French and Spanish over who controlled parts of North America, including Florida, the English armed Creek and Yamasee Indians from the north. They were from Georgia, Alabama. They eventually became Seminoles. They armed them with rifles. And of course, the Calusa had no weapons, no firearms. And these Indians enslaved the Calusa, captured them to work in Cuba, in mines and agriculture. And they were even sold in the slave markets in Charleston, where many African slaves were sold. By 1711, 200 years after they were discovered by the Europeans, this Calusa had pretty much succumbed to destruction from violence, disease. And the last Calusa were seen in 1763, a couple of them as they were sold into slavery in Cuba. We have no Calusa left in Florida. The Native Indians in South Florida are Miccosukee and Seminoles, who are descendant of Indians that came down in the 1700s from Georgia and from Alabama. So after the Calusa were decimated, Pine Island was pretty much abandoned for 100 years. There was no one here. Finally, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Cuban fishermen came into the area and made small settlements and began to fish and export fish to Cuba. Spain ceded Florida to the United States in 1822. And so more and more North Americans came in to establish small fishing villages. In the 1830s, Cubans came in to build huts and establish fishing villages on Sanibel Island and other small islands in Pine Island Sound. And some of the Cubans married local indigenous women, and they grew families. We can see pictures of some of those families. The Padilla family, in particular, We have a beautiful photograph of them made up of North Americans and also natives. The Seminole Wars began in the early 1800s as the United States was determined to remove Seminoles, black Seminoles, and runaway slaves from Central and North Florida. And most of the natives were removed, mostly to Oklahoma reservations. Florida became a state in 1845, and more white settlers came into the area. On Sanibel Island, they tried crops, growing hemp for rope, didn't work too well. And fishing really is what the families relied upon, including the Tobia Padilla family. They used nets to fish, unlike the early Spanish and other Europeans who used lines and hooks. But the Calusa were very clever the way they fished, and they made nets out of fibers from coconut trees that they spun. And so the Europeans copied them and began to make nets to catch much larger numbers of fish. The Pine Island developed somewhat. There was a lighthouse built in the southern end of Sanibel Island in 1884. More settlers came in. They continued fishing, and they began shipping ice north from Punta Gorda and the inside of Charlotte Harbor. They began to ship fish north by train with ice. A big hotel was built in 1886, the San Carlos Hotel, which is no longer there. By World War I, only 100 people lived on Pine Island, and a bridge was built over to the island in 1926, and Pine Island got electric service in 1941. The population grew to a few thousand. As Pine Island's population grew to a few thousand, roads were built, causeway was built over in 1926, and a lot of the shellfish beds and the middens, which were made up of mounds of discarded shellfish and fish bones by the Calusa, they were mined. They actually mined these and used them as beds for roads and for housing development. Unfortunately, a lot of this was destroyed. Now, Pine Island, for its name, was covered with pinelands and subtropical mangroves and palmetto surrounding it. Also, the tall, stately sable palm, which is Florida's native tree. Pine Island is special because it's surrounded by water on all three sides, and there's no frosts that occur. Farmers in South Florida have to worry about frosts a few times in the winter. The Pine Island never has freezing temperatures, so it's very popular with fruit groves, orchards, and tree nurseries. They grew palms to sell for landscaping and so on. And much of the forests on Pine Island were felled. They were logged in the early 1900s. Much of the mangrove forests were destroyed, and the wetlands drained and filled. Not all of it. As we'll see, there's been great efforts to preserve much of that. As they built the causeway, they created islands called Matlacha, the area that comes over from the mainland into Pine Island, and they used the Calusa mounds and oyster beds to dredge and fill to create these islands to build the causeway across. They also dug up oyster beds to use as fill. In the last 100 years or so, about 80% of the native slash pine and palmettos have been cleared for housing and these forests. 8% has been preserved by local organizations, and about 12% still remain under pressure. Beginning in the 1970s, some local groups on Pine Island, especially the Calusa Land Trust, a group of local volunteers and families and small business people, saw the remaining pine and mangrove forests were under threat of destruction for development, and they began to take measures to preserve them. They didn't want Pine Island to become an extension of Cape Coral, which is the mainland area across the causeway, which today is all suburbs, heavy home development, like much of Florida that has undergone so much growth. They wanted Pine Island to remain that special rural fishing community that it had been for hundreds of years. So the Calusa Land Trust, since the 1970s, have acquired over 2,400 acres of native wetlands, pine forests, and they help protect 2/3 of the mangrove forests that surround Pine Island on its shore. Today, they manage 67 parcels of land, and they recognize mangroves as very important elements. That's where young fish have their nurseries, where they grow. So we're with John and Lester from the Calusa Land Trust.
It's 420 acres. It was purchased in 9 separate steps. Most of it is mangroves. It was intended as an extension of the St. Jude Harbor subdivision, which is where I live. It was a housing development. It was another 200 homes. We're going to go through the St. Jude Nature Trail, which was St. Jude Boulevard extended. And it was to have a Circle K, high-rise, whatever, more development. And instead, we have 420 acres never to be developed.
And we got some gorgeous, these
red mangroves.
These are red mangroves.
We're in an estuary, and an estuary defined is where salt water meets fresh water. Mm-hmm. And it's probably in life the most prolific places on the planet. Where we're standing here, Brent, is the St. Jude Nature Trail, which is the intended St. Jude Boulevard.
This would have been a suburban boulevard with Circle Ks and hundreds of homes.
Where we came in, right about there would be in a Circle K or a 7-Eleven or something like that, with grocery stores and bars. Yes, we don't get any, nor will we take any public funds in the sense of governmental funds. We've helped assist the county and the state in acquiring property in their name. So we're all volunteers, all supported by Pine Islanders. And St. Jude Boulevard is, by definition, a boulevard. You're probably in the center of St. Jude Boulevard right now. This is a neem, N-E-E-M, which is a tropical deciduous tree. And this is a bad guy. This is Brazilian pepper. And much like Australian pine, earleaf acacia, carrotwood, you go right down the line. Initially brought in to beautify the area, it takes over native habitats, which means it destroys the entire system. When you take out the flora and the fauna, it takes out the birds, it takes out the animals, it takes out everything.
Tell me what this is, Lester, that we're looking at now.
Well, you can see the salt marsh right here, and the root system associated with the salt marsh here. See the roots going down into the water?
Yeah. And so this would always be wet in here.
Yeah, this area. This is always wet. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the rest of it is just tidal area. So the water comes in and out, brackish, depending on the tides.
Yeah, it's mostly salt water because there is not that much freshwater input right here. So most of the freshwater input would be like the Caloosahatchee coming in, the river coming in. So you have that influence in this area. But right here, it's probably, the tidal probably dominates.
We're going to take you, go this way, look out, cross St. James Creek. Do you see any man-made structures?
No.
Condos, high-rises. It doesn't look any different today than it did 2,000 years ago when the Calusa Indians were here. And we've created this as a preserve for that. On the other side of that is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Nature Preserve. And then Cement City, Cape Coral begins. Actually, we own that on the other side as well.
Part of the 425-acre acquisition for this includes what's across the creek.
It does.
And that goes all the way out to the main body of water near Matlacha.
Matlacha Pass, yeah, Matlacha Pass.
And if we're looking at what the mainland looks like in terms of development, let's have a look at what this area would be if you guys weren't active. That's Cape Coral, and that is all developed subdivisions.
It's all cordoned off and built up on.
Dolphin right there.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. The dolphin takes precedence. They're wonderful animals. Very smart. Look, he's coming right towards us.
Mr. Morgan, thank you for preserving the area.
Yeah, watch him. Watch him.
Come here, baby. Hi.
Hi, James. Yeah. Oh, look at you. Feels very cheerfully.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a favorite fishing area. Certainly. You pass through and go into the area right there. Yeah.
They play.
Isn't that cool?
Coming for another turn.
Yeah, he knows we're here and we're playing for him.
And the other big animal things through here, the manatees. That's why the Manatee Pass is named up above at the northern end of this creek. Manatees that come in. And they're 1,000-pound animals that come in.
He's not fishing, he's playing.
What a gorgeous piece of property.
Yeah, it's great area to kayak.
It's the way it was thousands of years ago, and it's going to stay that way.
Don't make us look too favorable. We don't want people moving here, okay? I bet you I see a bald eagle every day. But I love the hawks.
You saw the osprey.
Owls.
You saw the osprey nest, and you'll see the eagle and the osprey competing for fish.
Yes, and we had roseated spoonbill. We had 4 of them just in this area just a few days ago. Wood storks, I know they're endangered. They're all over this place. They have a unique nesting area where there has to be not too deep, not too shallow to get the food to feed to their babies.
You can see the mangroves here and their roots going down.
And this is a launch.
These are all red mangroves, which is critical habitat for nursery for marine life, crabs, fish.
Yep, the reds are influenced by the salt water all the time.
And also mangroves store vast amounts of carbon dioxide. They're called blue carbon. There's been other organizations that have helped, but the Calusa Land Trust, who we had the good fortune to meet, walk through some of their preserved areas. They preserved some of the most important are the Pine Island Flatwoods Preserve on Pine Island, 792 acres, safe from development. On the northwest of Pine Island is a 325-acre Big Jim Preserve with creeks and bays and tidals, flats, home to egrets, ibis, heron, roseate spoonbill. York Island is on the southwest side of the southern point of Pine Island. It was saved from development in 1998. It was mostly black mangroves, which are a little inland from the red mangroves. They had rare gumbo limbo and a tropical hammock, home to many wading birds, a natural fishing industry. So they were able to preserve 200 acres on York Island. St. James Creek, 320 acres. Pine Island Preserve, Pine Island Eagle Preserve, 118. They've done much to preserve Pine Island, and they've implemented the Pine Island Plan in conjunction with the counties to limit growth. And they had a lot of opposition from developers, but they made a lot of progress in doing that. Pine Island Sound, which of course is the estuary off of Pine Island, lost about 30% of the seagrass in the 1940s through the 1980s, but has recovered over the years from improved water quality. The seagrass meadows in Pine Island Sound, which are called the Pine Island Sound Aquatic Preserve, are 55,000 acres. And the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserve to the north is 85,000 acres, and they are protected by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. There are also some very well-known national wildlife preserves in the surrounding area. On nearby Sanibel Island, in 1945, the Ding Darling National Wildlife Reserve was established. It protects 6,000 acres from what was going to be a housing development, and it's the largest preserve of mangroves in the U.S., known for the population of spectacular migratory birds. The Pine Island Wildlife Preserve was established in 1908 by President Teddy Roosevelt and protects 603 acres on 17 islands, mostly the little islands in the north half of Pine Island Sound. There are many wading, diving birds, and colonial rookeries. We talked about Matlacha, which is the island created from fill for the Cosby coming across, and that is a national wildlife refuge of 500 acres on 23 islands. So much has been lost, but much is being preserved and has been preserved. Wetlands, mangrove, salt marshes were lost from development, and forests were cut down, but thanks to the dedication of local individuals and groups, in particular, the Calusa Land Trust, their dedication for the last several decades, much of Pine Island Sound, pine forests, mangroves have been preserved. They're teeming with wildlife, and future generations can enjoy them. Pine Island Sound and Pine Island itself have been preserved. Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Guru podcast. Stay inspired, stay informed, and keep taking action for our planet's future. Until next time, and remember, together we can make a difference.